give the floor now to Jori Sonneveld, who's going to introduce our plenary speaker for tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gideon. So a big thank you to Gideon for moderating this evening. Thank you. So I'm very excited to present to you our evening plenary speaker. This is Pauline Gagnon from Quebec in Canada. She did her PhD in California. And then she moved to CERN to work on Opal and then later Atlas at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Geneva. And there she started also writing writing blogs and working in science communication. And after she retired, she wrote a book. She published a book, Who Cares About Particle Physics? Making sense of the Higgs boson, the Large Hadron Collider, and CERN. But tonight she will speak to us. She's also still doing research. She will speak to us about the tragic destiny of Mileva Maric Einstein. So now I will leave all the talking to her. A big welcome to Pauline Gagnon.
Thank you very much. Oh, this is good. There are so many spots in the face we don't see everybody. It's not so intimidating. But thank you very much, Jori, for the very kind introduction. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me. And I'm going to talk about a subject that is a bit sad, about the tragic destiny of Mileva Maric Einstein. So, the big question is, everybody knows about her husband, but why was she forgotten? So that's the answer that I'm going to try to give tonight. And the plan of my talk is to examine the 20 years of their collaboration, and mostly based on documents and testimonies, but I will also take into account the historical context and their personal circumstances, because you'll see it has played a major role in it. We don't have many documents to prove it, but when you look at the whole picture, it's clear. And so my goal is not to denigrate Albert Einstein, but you will see that he comes out as a human being, a flawed human being. But mostly, I want to pay justice to an incredible woman, Mileva Maric Einstein. And so Mileva was born in 1875, so about 150 years ago, in Vojvodina, and this is, today it's part of Serbia, but then it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in those days, the girls were not allowed to attend school past high school, and she got a special, her father got a special authorization in 1892 that she could follow some physics classes in Zagreb with the boys. And then later she went to Zurich to finish her high school degree. And her temperament, that was described by her school friends and all that, was that she was very brilliant but terribly reserved. She was not a talkative person. She would not put herself forward. But she was very persistent and determined. She got to the bottom of things. So she knew where she was going, and she kept going towards her goal. Albert Einstein was completely different in temperament. He himself was born in Germany, in Ulm, very close to where I live now, in about 70 kilometers from Nürtingen, where I live. So it's in the southwest of Germany. He was born in a Jewish family, and he was a very inquisitive person. He was very curious, but very bohemian and rebel. That we have all heard about. He was not very disciplined, and he hated how it was in the German schools because there was too much rigor, too much discipline. He was known to be very insolent and sarcastic and mocking of people. And so because he didn't like the discipline in Germany, he ended up too going to Switzerland, to Zurich, to finish his high school. And they met in 1896 when they both got admitted to the Polytechnic School in Zurich, which is now known as the ETH. There were 5 students in the program. 3 of them were in, 3 young men were in the mathematics section, and Mileva and Albert were the only 2 physics students. Albert, see, dapper young man here, was the youngest one, and Mileva was the oldest of the class. You have to understand that in Switzerland, the University of Zurich was the only German-speaking university in Europe admitting women to their schools. And so Mileva, they had opened it 46 years before Mileva, but she was only the 5th woman to have been taken in, and none had graduated. The first woman graduated with a PhD in mathematics. Physics, it took even longer. In 1902, a Norwegian woman called Elisabeth Stephensen. And so in the 1896, there were about 20 women in natural sciences in all of Switzerland. From the beginning, Albert and Mileva discovered that they had a passion, both of them, for physics, for music, and it didn't take long for each other. And they spent all their time together in Mileva's pension, in her room, reading articles and reading papers and studying books. And what did I say? Well, you see the other things too, but that comes a bit later. That comes just a bit later. So they were really passionate, and they were always... Albert didn't like the classes because he thought that they were antiquated. They didn't want to teach about Maxwell's equations and stuff like that. So they preferred to read books together, discuss, and do their own stuff. And friends of Mileva who were in that pension also said that they were always together, like Helen Koffler, with whom Mileva exchanged letters throughout her life. So we will hear more about Helen throughout the talk, as well as Milena Bota, another friend from Serbia, and they both testified how they were always together. The letters that Mileva sent to her friend Helen Koffler-Savage were published in this book by the grandson of Helen Koffler-Savage, Dr. Milan Popovic, and it's interesting to see what was going on. But where we learn more about that period of time is through the letters that Albert and Mileva exchanged during their studies, because they were so often separated when both of them, during the school holidays, Easter, summer, Christmas vacation, they would go back to their families and they were not together. And so there are 43 letters that Albert sent to Mileva that are preserved up to now, but only 11 letters from Mileva, so we have more of Albert's viewpoint. These letters are now published in this book by Wren and Schulman called The Love Letters. The best biography about Mileva Maric was written by Professor Radmila Milentijevic. She was a professor of history at the City College of New York. And she notes that through those letters, it's peppered with expressions such as our new studies, our research, our viewpoint, our theory, our article, our work on relative motion. So through those letters, you get a sense of what they were doing in that bedroom that is of interest to us today. So the beginning of their collaboration, they spent countless hours, as I said, reading and discussing together. And Albert wrote when he was away for one vacation, he says, "When I read Helmholtz for the first time, it seemed inconceivable that you were not with me. And now it's not much better. I find the collaboration very good, curative, and also less desiccating." So he found it much easier to work together. And another day, we can get also a sense of how it was going. He writes, "The climate here," visiting his family, his family had moved to Milan in Italy. He said, "The climate here doesn't suit me, and while I miss work, I find myself filled with dark thoughts. In other words, I miss having you nearby to kindly keep me in check and prevent me from meandering." So Albert was known to be a happy-go-lucky, disorganized and all that, and she kept him focusing on what was important. Here are the results of their written exams. And so for all the written exam at the ETH, they have essentially the same grade. Mileva slightly better, but that's almost irrelevant. And so out of a maximum of 6 points, they got 4.75. But then came the oral exam, and it was with Herman Minkowski of the Minkowski spaces. And he gave 11 out of 12 to the 4 young men in the class, but Mileva got 5 out of 12. And because of that, she didn't pass the exam. The passing grade here was 5. Albert Einstein didn't have it either, but he passed him. But she was flunked. And remember that the Institute had never granted a PhD in math or physics to any women before her. So the 3 other students got an academic position, but Albert, who had been very insolent and all that, he kept calling his professor, Professor Weber. He would call him Mr. Weber. And Weber was always very insulted about that, and he didn't like Einstein at all, didn't like Albert at all. And he was probably writing negative recommendation letters. So he says, Albert says that he sent applications all over Europe, but he starts suspecting that Weber is blocking him. And without a job, he refuses to marry Mileva, but they continue to live and work as before, as Mileva wrote to her friend. But it starts to be very difficult because Albert's mother, oh no, that's not that, that's this, yeah, this one. Yeah, Albert's mother, that's Pauline Einstein, Pauline la Puffin. So the nasty Pauline she has. His mother is absolutely opposed to this relationship. She is from a very she was from a very rich family, and she doesn't like that Mileva is with Albert, partly because she's slightly older, and she says when you're 30, she will already be an old hag. So I don't know what we are, but... And then she also says that she cannot enter a respectable family. She didn't like the fact that she was not Jewish, the fact that Mileva had a congenital problem at the hip, and she was limping. She could not walk properly. And there were prejudices against Slavic people, just like even again today. Albert's father is also requesting that Albert would get a job before getting married. And on top of that, his father, Herman Einstein, he had a business for electromechanical devices, and he failed, so he didn't have money anymore to support his son. So they continue to work together, and as Albert wrote right after that during the summer vacation, I look forward to resume our common work. You must now continue with your research. So you see, she was also doing things independently. How proud I will be to have a doctor for my spouse when I'll only be an ordinary man. And so they come back to Zurich in the fall, both of them, to complete their thesis work for the doctorate degree, and they resume their common studies as well. And just before coming back to Zurich, Albert writes to Mileva, I just found something very interesting about capillarity. It's very simple, but it appears to be new. So when we are back, we'll try together to some empirical data on this subject. He writes that in a letter. But then, 3 months later, he says, we will send a copy to Boltzmann. Mileva writes that to Helen Savage. She says, we also sent a copy to Boltzmann, who was the head of the NWO Physics at the time. And we would like to know what he thinks of it. I hope he will write to us. And so Albert also referred to this article saying that he gave, his friends gave it to his uncle, who was a famous professor of physics in Italy. And he says, he gave him a copy of our article. So you see, both of them refer to this article as common work, but this is the first article that appeared, published in the NWO Physics, signed by Albert only. Why was it so? Well, you have to understand that Mileva's happiness, her dream, was to be able to do physics with Albert. She loved working with him and discussing with him, and those two were really getting very well along about physics, and her own happiness depended on his success. He was so disorganized, he could not get a job. So it was very, and he would not marry her until he had a job. So, of course, helping him publish papers, get known, and maybe he would get a job after that. But the other thing is that Mileva didn't have a degree, like Albert received his diploma, but not Mileva. And so, without a degree, she had no legitimacy to sign an article. It would almost be superchery. So for Mileva, they were also one unique entity. Sometime later, a few years later, they had worked on building a multimeter, very precise instrument. They did that with a friend, Conrad Habich. And Albert wrote a patent. He was at the patent office then to get this patent out. And it was known as the Einstein-Habich patent. And so Conrad Habich asked Mileva, but why didn't you put your name there? And she said in German, warum wir beide sind nur Einstein? So the two of us together with just one stone. We are one. So for her, if it was Albert who published or her, it was not so important. And another biographer of Mileva Maric, Dort Kirstisch, thinks that since so few women were publishing papers in the Annalen Physics at the time, it would probably have looked not so good if the article was signed not only by two people, but one was a woman. So it's not foolish because even 50 years ago, articles published by men received twice as many citations as women. Even today, there's still a difference of about 5 to 10%. So there are many reasons that led us to believe that probably they agreed together to publish this work that they refer to together as common work, but he alone signed it. And very soon after that, that's where he wrote the most important quote that we have about their work, when he says, "How happy and proud I will be when the two of us together will have brought our work on relative motion to a victorious conclusion." This is crystal clear. This makes no doubt that they were together working on special relativity at the time. But that's the time where Mileva's destiny changed. They're separated since a few months because Einstein's father doesn't have money to support his son anymore. So Albert had to go back to his family. And he's longing to see Mileva, and he pesters her, "Come and visit me in Como, and we'll have an escapade together in the weekend." And sure enough, she got pregnant. So they didn't just study during that weekend. So without a job, Albert kept refusing to marry her. But then it's really tough because it's her second and last chance for the oral exam. This time it's the Professor Weber, the one that Albert has repeatedly insulted and annoyed. And of course, it's well known that they're a couple, so what surprise is that it's her second failure, and she loses her visa as a student, and she must return to Serbia. But twice she would come back to Zurich to try to convince Albert to marry her. But she gave birth to a little girl, Liesel, in January 1902, and Albert, that happened at the end of January 1902, but already in December, Albert he knows that he will get this job at the patent office, thanks to a friend of his, Marcel Grossman, who was in his class, and his father intervened to get that job for Albert. And then Albert writes, "When you will be my little wife, we shall resume diligently our scientific work, such as not to become Philistines." So Philistines is uneducated people. So you see, it's clear that they were working together. But a few months before, Albert had promised, "The minute I have a job, I'll marry you without telling anybody." But there is no mention of marriage, and he never went to visit that child in Serbia. Mileva had to abandon her daughter, and after that, she started suffering from chronic depression. So about a year after the birth of their child, they got married in Zurich, in Bern, where Albert had moved for this job. He had started in June, working there. And no one knows what happened to that little girl, Liesel. She was most likely given for adoption in the fall. There are two scenarios that are proposed by historians. Or she might have died in September of '93 of scarlet fever. But I'm not a historian, I'm a scientist, so I convinced some people to do a DNA test, and I hope to have answers. In fact, one woman today sent me an email saying, okay, now I'll do it. So we should, she's a relative of the Maric family, because the Einstein family, they don't want to give DNA or have anything to do with Mileva. So I hope to have an answer on this. So back in Bern, 1903, Albert works at the patent office 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. Mileva assumes the domestic task, and they work together in the evening, sometimes late at night, on the dining room table. And this is the apartment where they were in Bern, and it's now a little museum called Einstein's house. And a year later, their son, their oldest son, Hans Albert, is born. And after that comes the miracle year, where Albert signed 5 of his most 5 important articles that really revolutionized physics at the time. The first one was on the photoelectric effect, and he got the Nobel Prize for that in 1921. The next 2 papers were on Brownian motion. And Brownian motion, we don't think much of it today, but this is what proved the existence of molecules and atoms, which was not known until then. So it was a major breakthrough. And then special relativity and the equivalence, mass and energy. And so contrary to what the speaker said this morning, photoelectric effect is not from Albert alone, but it was common work that he did with Mileva. In his spare time, this young man who works 8 hours a day, 6 days a week at the patent office found time to comment on 19 scientific papers, because he received money when they sent comments, and Albert always wanted a little bit money. And he also, because they had problem making ends meet, and he submitted his doctoral thesis in April on the dimensions of the molecules. But he told one of his biographers a few years before his death that his work on relativity had been with him for more than 7 years, and the photoelectric effect for 5 years. So you see, in 1905, it brings us back to the time where they were always discussing physics and calculating and debating together. Another biographer of Einstein writes that after having worked 5 weeks to complete the article containing the basis of special relativity, Albert spent 2 weeks in bed while Mileva read the article over and over before posting it. And I bet you she was not just checking the grammar. So they were exhausted, and for the first time, they took a vacation and they went to visit the Maric family in Serbia. So it was the first of 3 visits that they made there, and thanks to those visits, they met with lots of friends and relatives there, and there are numerous testimonies that have come to us today thanks to that visit. This guy here, Dor de Kirchtig, here, he's deceased now, was a professor of computing sciences. He was trained as a physicist, but he taught computing sciences at the university in Ljubljana. He spent 50 years going all over Serbia to find people who had met Mileva and Albert during their visits and to collect testimonies. We see him here with Hans Albert, their oldest son from Albert and Mileva. And Hans Albert told Kirchtig that their scientific collaboration continued into their marriage, and that he remembered seeing his parents work together in the evenings at the same table. We also have testimonies coming from Mileva's brother, Milos. Milos was a medical student in Romania, but he took a semester in Bern and one semester in Paris. And in Bern, then he lived with the Einstein family, and so he could see how they were working. So he had a chance to see how Albert and Mileva were behaving together. And Miloš described how during the evenings and at night, when silence fell upon the town, the young married couple would sit together at the table, and at the light of a kerosene lantern, they would work together on physics problems. Miloš Jr. spoke of how they calculated, wrote, read, and debated. And he told that to all sorts of people, this story. And Kirstich got this information from the godparents from Mileva. Those godparents are of Sidonia Gagnon, and also from a cousin from Mileva, Sofia Galish-Golubovic. And so he also takes, Kirstich explained that Miloš was someone known for his integrity, someone who stuck to facts rather than to his own opinion. Other testimonies, for example, when they arrive in Novi Sad, in the city where, in Serbia, where her family lived, Mileva told her father, "We just finished an important scientific work which will make my husband known around the world." So she really knew what she was talking about. And this cousin was living, Sofia Galish-Golubovic was living with the Maric family at the time, and she was there present, and she heard it, and she repeated that to Kirstich at some point. And then the godmother, and as well as a cousin from Mileva's father, Žarko Maric, said the same sentence, but they were not there, but they had heard it from Mileva's father himself. This cousin from Miloš Maric, the father, Žarko Maric, was managing a property that the Maric family had in the countryside, and that's where Albert and Mileva stayed during their visit. And he says, he described to Dort Kirstich how Mileva took care of the kids while his own wife was cooking for the whole gang. And Mileva would calculate, write, and work with Albert. And they would sit in the shade here on the side of this house. They had a nice garden with apple trees. They would sit in the shade, drink tons of coffee, and discuss a lot. And harmony and mutual respect was visible, according to Žarko Maric. Another testimony from that period is that the mayor of Novi Sad is a major city. I was just there a few weeks ago. It's a major city in Serbia. And the mayor said, I need, that he heard Albert Einstein telling him, "I need my wife. She solves all my mathematical problems for me." And so there are different people who are quoting that. But Albert himself wrote something about that, how he relied on Mileva's help for mathematics. In 1908, at Easter time, Mileva went to visit her family with her son, and Albert hired a young postdoc to work with him, and the guy was Jacob Laub, was living with Albert in the same house. And Albert didn't like him much. He thought he was quite full of himself, this young man. But at least he was doing the calculations, he wrote, for which I would not have the time, and that's good. So it's clear that when Mileva is not there, he's struggling because he's still working at the patent office. It's not until 1908, so 3 years after he published those incredible papers in 1905, that he finally got an unpaid position at the University of Bern as a lecturer, and he was doing that after his job at the office. But finally, his thesis advisor, Professor Kleiner from ETH, opened a post for him at the University of Zurich, and he went there, but then he didn't like the salary, so he got himself a job offer in Prague. When the salary increased in Zurich, he came back a year later, and later on, he finally went to Berlin. We'll see why in a minute. Meanwhile, just before going to Prague, their second son, Edward, was born. And we see that Mileva is still helping Albert in his work at this time. The first 8 pages of his lectures on analytical mechanics given in Zurich are written in the hand of Mileva. These documents are available at the Albert Einstein Archives at the Hebraic University in Jerusalem. But there is also the draft of a reply to a request by Max Planck that is also written in the hand of Mileva. Planck solicited Albert Einstein's opinion on a paper that he wanted to publish, and it's Mileva who drafted the reply. Who would give a letter to, a reply to write to Max Planck to a secretary? No, it's not the case. She knew what she was talking about. So there's a time where success is starting to come to Albert, but Mileva gets increasingly worried about it. She says about Albert, he's now regarded as the best German-speaking physicist. He received lots of honor and he deserves it, and I'm quite happy for it. But I just hope that this fame will not have a harmful effect on his humanity. And shortly later, she wrote again to Helen Savage, what do you want to do with fame? One gets the pearl, the other the shell. So Einstein's temperament also changed at that time. When he was in Prague, he met Philipp Frank, who later wrote a biography about Einstein. And Frank wrote that given his great discoveries, Einstein felt invulnerable. His conversation could be a combination of harmless jokes or hurtful comments. So you never knew what to expect from this guy. It could be very nice or totally nasty. And one of his students at the time also said that Albert's growing success filled his soul with a feeling of superiority and sometimes arrogance bordering hubris. So success and arrogance for Albert, and depression and second rank for Mileva, because more and more physicists from all over Europe want to work with Albert, and Mileva is being pushed to the side. And so their relationships start to crumble. Up to 1911, there's still postcards with affectionate notes when Albert was going to conferences. But in 1912, his family had moved to Berlin, and he renews his friendship with his cousin and developed an affair with her, Elsa Löwenthal, during a visit to his mother in 1912. But Pauline Einstein, she still could not stand Mileva. And now that Albert was famous and all that, she thought that Mileva was too taciturn and dull and not enough of a socialite. And look at Elsa. Elsa was just shining in the limelight, and she was a socialite, and she loved parties and newspapers and stuff like that, which was completely the opposite of Mileva. So Pauline Einstein pushes Albert also towards this woman and tries to get Mileva out of the way. And that's where Albert writes, so they move to Berlin. Mileva is opposed to that. She knows that there is this affair with Elsa going on. And on top of but she doesn't want to separate. But Albert tells her, if you want to stay with me, okay. But he writes a letter, it's a terrible letter, telling her, you have to wash my clothes, you have to clean my space and cook my meals, and you're not allowed anymore to sit at my desk, which is a very funny thing to put in a nasty letter. You're not allowed to sit at my desk, because they were still working together just about up to this time. And you're not allowed to sit next to me at home, because that's the way they were always working. So she has no choice, but she leaves on the eve of the First World War I, and she returns to Zurich. And then it started a period of 30 years where Mileva lived in poverty. And she was with her two sons. Edward, the second child, had long problem with pneumonia and things like that. And he was often hospitalized in sanatorium, and that was naturally very costly. Mileva also had a serious depression, and she could not walk anymore. She was so destroyed by it. And so she also spent about a year in the hospital. And most of her life, she would struggle financially to make ends meet, because Albert was supposed to send the alimony money, but he would not send it, or just partially. So it was always difficult. And with those medical expenses, she had always problems. Except in 1919, 5 years after the separation, she finally accepted a divorce. But thanks to her lawyer who negotiated that, one clause of the divorce agreement stated that if Albert received the Nobel Prize, she would get the money. So she got the money, but with that money, she bought 3 small apartment buildings in Zurich, but soon there was the economic crash in 1929, and she lost 2 of them because the tenants could not pay the rent. She managed to save the one where she lived. We see her there with her sons on the balcony. And this young woman here is Frida, the wife of Hans Albert, his first wife. And so, but Edward also developed schizophrenia around the age of 20 years. And he was often hospitalized throughout his life in psychiatric hospitals. So, but Mileva would not talk publicly, but she talked in private to some of her close friends. And she confided, for example, to her friend Milena Botta, one of the women with whom she shared that pension in Zurich. And Milena Botta reported that to a journalist in the most important newspaper in Serbia, the newspaper Politika. And so she said, she had said that she had always worked with Albert. She said the same thing to her student, Maya Shukan, who repeated it to a biographer of Albert Einstein. She mentioned it to her godparents, and they said it to Albert Einstein. She also added that Albert had ruined her life. And she talked about that with her son, her mother, and sisters, according to Dor de Kirchtisch. But the Einstein myth was born, you know, those pictures of Albert, you know, like riding the bike like this, or sticking his tongue or whatever. You know, the myth about Albert Einstein started by his secretary, Ellen Dukas. She started with him in Berlin, moved with him to Princeton in the US when he was persecuted by the Nazi regime in 1939, I think. And then, no, 33, sorry. And another one, a friend of Albert, Otto Nathan. Both of them became executor after the death of Albert Einstein, and they inherited his intellectual properties. And those 2 people did everything they could to suppress the story of Mileva. I met a historian of physics, professor who has done lots of research. Pianson is his name, and he told me that he was doing research on Albert Einstein, and he needed to see documents, and those 2 were the keepers of the documents, and they would give him some papers, but then when he wrote articles that he wanted to publish, they would tell him, we don't like what you say here, you have to change that, or you cannot quote those papers. So he said, I was a young researcher, I was trying to establish myself, so I did exactly what they told me to do because I had no choice. So they really controlled the information on all the properties, that intellectual property that they had. After Mileva's death, Otto Nathan went to visit the apartment and probably cleaned up most of the papers that he could find there. Fortunately, Frida, the wife of Hans Albert, got to Mileva's house first, and she found a box of letters, the love letters that I mentioned earlier. And so they got eventually published. But Otto Nathan and Ellen Dukas blocked the publication of those letters. Hans Albert wanted to publish those letters after the death of his father in 1955, and they opposed him. They took him to court in Zurich, in Bern, to prevent him from publishing letters that he had received from his parents, including personal letters that he had received from his father, because they had the intellectual property of Albert Einstein. And it's only after their own death, Nathan and Dukas, in 82 and 87, that the letters finally came out, and we now know the story of Mileva. The other myth. People look at him and say, look at the guy, you know. Just by looking at him, we can see that he was a genius and all that. Man, no. It's a genetic problem. It's a genetic problem they had in the family with hair. You know, if there is a genius in the family, it's his sister, Mileva Einstein there. So, fame for Albert and total oblivion for Mileva. And she was visiting her son in 1948 in the winter at the psychiatric hospital, and she slipped she slid on ice and broke her hip, and she died the following August in 1948. There is a small memorial in Zurich at the cemetery about her that says, "With pride and love, the people of Serbia." And there is also a memorial statue, a bust, in Novi Sad at the university on the campus about her. In Serbia, she's a national hero, but she's about unknown elsewhere in the world. So my conclusions is that the proof for their collaboration, the clearest evidence, comes from Albert Einstein himself when he wrote our work on relative motion. Looking at how they interacted and worked in that bedroom and all that together, by today's standards, they would be scientific collaborators. Handwritten documents from Mileva's hand, like the letter to Planck and the notes for the Zurich lectures, and the numerous testimonies that I have mentioned. More speculative arguments, the fact that Albert gave her the money from the Nobel Prize, as if it's at least giving her something for what she had done. And also the decline in Albert Einstein's creativity and productivity after the separation. He was at the forefront of modern physics when he discovered photoelectric effect and the Brownian motion and the existence of molecules and all that. He was the founder of quantum physics, and he spent countless years arguing with Niels Bohr and nearly driving him insane with counter-argument, saying that quantum mechanics was something silly. And the quote we know that God doesn't play dice with the universe. So he who was at the forefront of physics in 1905 just never accepted quantum mechanics later on. In my opinion, their union was based on love and respect. Together, really together. It's not her, it's not him, it's together. You know, when you have a good collaboration with someone, you can produce much better results. So they produce uncommon work, and their individual contributions, I believe, will never be disentangled. We cannot say she did that, he did that. That will never happen, I believe. Mileva was also the first person to recognize Albert's talent. And because she was so organized and systematic, she helped him make a name for himself and emerge. Without her emotional and intellectual support when his family was against him and all that, he would never have succeeded. She merged her own aspirations to become a physicist and a scientist. She put that behind her duty as a woman who had been raised in a very patriarchal society. It was her role as a woman to support her husband, and she did that just like her mother had done. But also she saw herself, she saw the two of them as being Einstein. So for her, she didn't need to be in the limelight by herself. And also try to imagine that, you know, the guy is being known all over the world and everybody says how good it is and all that. How can he say 4 or 5 years later when he finally got some recognition, did I tell you that everything I did it with my wife? You know, at one point, once they started this, of signing all the papers just under his name, you cannot backtrack. It becomes too late and impossible. why did she remain silent? Because she was a very reserved person, not after honor and fame. She spoke little of herself, and she always loved him, and she didn't want to give him bad press and all that. The other major point was that she had no degree, so no legitimacy. Of course, we cannot change history, but you can acknowledge the errors of the past. And that's why Italian physicist Gabriella Grayson asked ETH to grant a posthumous degree to Mileva Maric Einstein. And I went there too, and I gave my talk there and all that, and everybody was saying, yeah, you're right, you're right. And so we are asking ETH to grant Mileva Maric Einstein, as well as the 4 other women who were flunked before her, that they should receive a degree. Cambridge University did it with about 900 degrees that were not granted up to 1948. 900 women received a degree in 2013 or something like that. And in Scotland too, it was done. So it's possible. And I encourage you too here to write to the Dean of Science. Damn it, we have to do something about that. Thank you. Yeah. Gunther Disseter is in fact a physicist. He's a physicist and a member of the CMS collaboration and a very nice guy. So I think he needs just a little bit of encouragement. Now, one last point. Why is the story of Mileva Maric so different from the one from Maria Sklodowska-Curie? Both of them were born just 8 years apart. But when Marie met Pierre, they met and married a year later. And Pierre got his PhD right away. And as soon as he got his degree, he got a position as a professor at La Sorbonne. And so it was not a problem for him to sign papers jointly with his wife because he was already established, contrary to Albert, who was working in a technical job because he was a failed academic. So Marie got her PhD much later, and she didn't have a paid position at La Sorbonne. She had her lab was in a shed in the backyard. And then Pierre Curie heard in 1903 that he was nominated for the Nobel Prize alone. And he said, no way. If my wife, Marie, is not there with me, I will refuse the prize. And then they said, okay. And so they gave it also to Marie. And when she got the Nobel Prize, then La Sorbonne gave her a paid position for the first time. The same thing happened to Maria Goeppert-Mayer, the second woman who got a Nobel Prize in physics. So the best biography of Mileva Maric is from Radmila Milentijevic, as I mentioned, but the book is now out of print. Radmila Milentijevic died last September. She asked me to take care of her book. I'm looking for an editor. Oxford University Press just turned me down this week saying, oh, there are sort of, they had the comments negative comment by some reviewers. This myth about Albert Einstein is still so strong. The arguments didn't hold water, but my editor would not even discuss with me about it. So it's not an easy task. And there are many resources on my website about Mileva Maric Einstein, as well as a chapter in my book. So, the lone genius. And I believe this story about Albert Einstein is the biggest lie in the history of physics, and it's certainly in today's situation. And so we always present him as the lone genius, the guy who, out of the blue, from the patent office, produced those 5 incredible papers in 1905. So, and this image of the lone genius, which has nothing to do with how we work in science, is very detrimental to science because young people thinking of going into physics are quite intimidated by this. People how often have we heard jokes, oh, so you think you're the next Einstein, huh? And it's kind of intimidating. So let's forget about the lone genius and let's recognize the collaboration with Mileva Maric. So I'm currently working on a mini-series on Mileva Maric Einstein and other women scientists. And the terrible thing that I, with my collaborators, Vicky Lindsay, an astronomer, discovered in the process of doing the research, we thought we would find lots of women like Mileva Maric who were prevented from becoming full-fledged scientists. But what she found instead is lots of women who were extremely well known in their own days, especially astronomers, but they are absolutely unknown today. We use their results and their work, but we don't know that this work was done by women. You know, it's often the case with the Noether's theorem. Very few people know that it was Emmy Noether, a woman, who did it, and one of the most important theorems that we have in the particle physics. Maria Goeppert-Mayer, who had the second Nobel Prize, second woman, we don't know that she is responsible for the shell structure in the nucleus and things like that. So let's put the things as they are, and let's not talk about the lone genius, but a couple of geniuses. Thank you very much, and enjoy the dinner. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Pauline, for this very, very nice talk. I think we are all in suspense of what happened to Lisa and the results of the DNA test.
Yeah.
Here's a little thank you from us for your very nice talk tonight.
Thank
so
you.
A game on elementary particles. So let's give Pauline another applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.